After a tense vote in Flaxborough's council chamber, a body is found behind locked doors. Accident, or something more calculated? Take a moment before we begin. Mysteries reward those who notice what others overlook. What's your favorite era for a good mystery? If you enjoy tales of quiet corruption, subscribe and join the investigation. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. The moment Councillor Sybil Tolemacher slumped over her stack of handwritten notes, mid-sentence, mouth agape, spectacles askew, the chamber fell into a silence so absolute it seemed to rebuke the hour-long droning that had preceded it. She did not faint gracefully. Her shoulder caught the table mic with a snap, her gavel rolled to the floor, and a neatly folded amendment to the bylaw on public flower bed dimensions slid to the parquet in a slow, dignified flutter. A full 5 seconds passed before Councillor Biddle gasped theatrically, as if performing to a jury, and another 2 before someone finally said, "She's gone white as duck fat in February." By the time the ambulance arrived, flashing blue over the respectable hedges of the town hall's car park, the story had mutated with stunning elasticity. She choked on a barley sugar. They found it halfway to her lung. "No, poisoned. That handbag's not hers. Didn't match the shoes. I heard she got the threatening note before the meeting, not after. She was about to name someone, that's why. Couldn't stand another year of budget talks, poor cow. Someone swapped the agenda. I saw a second folder, green. Through this fog of civic melodrama and amateur sleuthery wafted something even more peculiar, the scent of carbolic soap. Very strong. Not from Mrs. Tollemache, who favored lavender sachets and dry cleaning, but emanating from the visitors' gallery steps. And beneath her chair, unnoticed by the paramedics or the gasping councillors, sat a dropped object, a child's shoe, black patent, size too small for anyone present, with a faded daisy sticker clinging to the sole. Inspector Purbright, having arrived with his usual quiet inevitability, gazed at the shoe, then at the unoccupied far corner of the room where, earlier, a young mother and child had briefly sat before being hushed out by the doorman. He gave the scene a slow blink, hands clasped behind his back, and offered to no one in particular. Timing tells more truth than testimony. The mayor, a man whose bluster grew in direct proportion to his uncertainty, cleared his throat. "I'm sure this is nothing sinister, Inspector. Just a sudden illness. Quite a shock for poor Sybil." "She did have a lot to say," murmured Miss Teatime, the deputy clerk, eyes wide. "About the old records. You know, the ones the borough archivist never catalogued." "Uh-huh," said the mayor, as if this solved everything. Nothing like dusty old files to give someone the turn. But Purbright knelt beside the fallen gavel, nudged the child's shoe lightly with one finger, and frowned. "Is something the matter?" asked the mayor. "Only," said Purbright, "that children rarely attend these meetings, and when they do, they tend to leave with both shoes." He straightened, calm as ever, and turned toward Miss Teatime. "You said she mentioned records. What sort exactly?" I don't know. She muttered something before the vote, about a ledger that had gone missing in the 1950s. Purbright gave a tiny, inscrutable nod, and took a step toward the table where Sybil Tolemache's notes, perfectly legible and bristling with tabs, remained open. But one page had been neatly torn out, not hurriedly ripped, not stolen by accident, carefully extracted. The missing page had been between 2 dealing with the 1949 sewer repiping debate and a proposal for allotment beekeeping licenses. Something, presumably, rather more urgent. Before Purbright could reach for the papers, the chamber door opened again. Constable Love walked in, pink-cheeked and apologetic. "Beg your pardon, sir, but someone's just found something in the cloakroom." "What sort of something?" "A note, pinned to Mrs. Tolemache's coat." With a safety pin, Purbright didn't move for a long beat. Then he asked, softly, Pinned outside or inside the lining? Inside, just above the hem. Ah, that was all he said. But when he reached for the counsellor's notes again, the page after the torn one had something curious in the margin, a scribbled phrase, faintly underlined. Not his handwriting, certainly not the 1937 entries. Purbright read it twice, then looked up, expression unchanged, but his eyes now held the precise glint of a man who had already begun asking the question behind the question. And before the mayor could offer tea or talk of adjournments, the room was interrupted again, not by collapse, not by drama, but by the clatter of glass. Downstairs in the reception hall, the cabinet containing the town's ceremonial trowel and mayoral whistle had just been smashed. The cabinet lay in shards beneath the gilt-framed portrait of Mayor Thistlewood's predecessor, whose expression of permanent disapproval now seemed almost smug. The ceremonial trowel, brass, commemorative, and largely ornamental, had slid part way under the radiator, while the whistle, meant to be blown once per mayoral term, and preferably not at all, sat innocently beside a half-sucked mint. Constable Love, flustered, held back a small crowd of murmuring council attendees who had followed the noise with all the decorum of a village mob stumbling upon a pie theft. The caretaker, Mr. Shipley, stood nearby with a dustpan he had no intention of using just yet. "Who was in here last?" Purbright asked, examining the broken cabinet. "Councilwoman Peebles, I believe," Shipley offered. "She came down to collect her umbrella. Said she had a hair appointment." "Did she leave with the umbrella?" "No, sir. Still on the stand. Patent one. Bit garish." Purbright crouched to look more closely at the floor beneath the cabinet. No footprints in the dust. Not yet, but a fine trail of glittering granules leading from the cabinet to the corridor. Sprinkles, Love guessed. Or... Purbright trailed off, running a gloved finger along the edge of the whistle. It came away with a trace of translucent powder. He sniffed it cautiously, then seemed to decide against any further investigation via nose. "Secure this area, would you? No more shoe traffic." "Already started telling them," said Love, waving at a man who had begun to tow at a chunk of glass with the investigative enthusiasm of a child at the beach. Back upstairs, the councillors were being herded out of the chamber under the guidance of the town clerk, who managed to convey both bureaucratic urgency and tea-related reassurance in herding them toward the members' lounge. Purbright remained behind, eyes again on the scattered papers of Sybil Tolemashi. He tapped the torn edge of the missing page thoughtfully, then turned to Miss Teatime, who had not moved far from her earlier perch by the microphone. "You mentioned Councillor Tolemache spoke of uncatalogued records?" "Yes, Inspector," she said, fidgeting with a paperclip that had migrated from the agenda packet to her skirt hem. She'd been pestering the historical subcommittee for weeks. Said there were gaps in the post-war minutes, ones that didn't match the central register. Did she specify a year? 1949, 1950. Around then. Something about the land audit for the new council estate. Not exactly recent grievances, Purbright observed. No, but Sybil had persistence. She called it municipal hygiene. Indeed. And did she show anyone the material she'd found? I only know she kept a separate folder in her bag. Not her usual leather one, the floral zip around. She was guarding it like it contained state secrets or allotment permits. Where is that bag now? Miss Teatime blinked, then looked toward the coat rack. It wasn't there. Purbright moved to the chamber door and beckoned Constable Love, who appeared with the air of someone hoping not to be assigned another puzzle involving broken ceremonial items. The councillor's floral bag. Was it among her things? No, sir, just the coat, with the pinned note. They've taken her to hospital, but her handbag wasn't with her. And the note? Love produced a sealed envelope from his tunic. Folded into the lining, sir. No address, just this. He passed over the envelope, which bore, in tight uppercase letters, "Do not archive." Purbright held it up to the light, revealing only the faint outline of a single sheet within. Heavier paper, no watermark. He slipped it into his coat. "We'll open it in a moment, but first, let's account for the missing bag." They moved briskly down the corridor toward the members' lounge. Inside, chairs had been rearranged around an impromptu tray of bourbon creams and municipal-grade tea. Several councillors milled about in dismay, with Councillor Biddle making himself central to the drama by sighing over his cracked thermos. "Someone's nicked Sybil's bag," he exclaimed when told. "But why? She only ever carried tissues and unfiled complaints." "She was carrying a second folder," Miss Teatime interjected, having followed discreetly behind. "Not the usual bag, the floral one." "I saw it," chirped Councillor Peebles from the sofa, where she was rearranging her hair into something less scandal-ready. "She had it on her lap before the meeting. Wouldn't let anyone near." "And now?" asked Purbright. "I've no idea. Maybe she left it in the loo." "We'll check," Purbright replied, though his tone implied he found that unlikely. But the real answer came sooner. A call came through from the hospital, not from the doctors, but from the ambulance crew. While transferring Mrs. Tolomach's coat, the porter had discovered an item tucked beneath her seat cushion in the vehicle. A floral zip bag, zipped halfway, its contents disordered. The hospital had secured it. Purbright nodded once and requested it be brought under seal to the station. Then he finally turned back to the envelope marked, "Do not archive." With no ceremony, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of town council stationery, aged, browned, creased in 3 places. But the handwriting was the thing. Neat, looping, and signed at the bottom in heavy ink. J.G. Fraumer. Purbright stared at the name for a long moment. Not for its presence, but for its placement. The signature sat below a paragraph authorizing the sale of several parcels of land bordering the disused gasworks. The oddity lay in the date, February 1949. J.G. Fraum had died in 1947. The discovery of a document signed by a man 2 years deceased should have prompted disbelief, perhaps even accusations of clerical error. But Inspector Purbright, having dealt with Flaxborough's layered history of polite deceit and archival fantasy, merely pressed the paper smooth and read the paragraph again. The letter authorized the release of 4 parcels of council land on the edge of the disused gasworks, an area long since absorbed into the indistinct boundary between town maintenance and bureaucratic amnesia. What stood out was not only the name at the bottom, but the casual familiarity of the signature, as though it had been dashed off last Thursday, not 17 months after its supposed author had been interred with civic honors. Purbright folded the letter carefully and slid it into a fresh evidence envelope without comment. In his experience, documents could lie even more convincingly than people. They had the advantage of silence and long shelf lives. Back at the station, the floral zippered bag arrived, wrapped in brown paper and carried by an uncomfortable-looking police driver who seemed personally offended by the pastel print. "It was under the stretcher seat," he explained, setting it down. "Barely noticed it. Thought it might be for the cleaners." Purbright waited until the man had gone before unwrapping it. The bag yielded its contents grudgingly. A pair of reading glasses, 3 biros, 2 chewed, a sheaf of old minutes clipped together by a faded blue bulldog clip, and, crumpled in the side pocket, a notebook. A soft-covered, spiral-bound one, yellowed at the corners, pages thick with annotations. He turned it open. The first page bore Sybil Tolomach's tidy handwriting. Cross-reference discrepancies, 1948 to 1951. Priority, land use logs. Councillor Fraum's listings inconsistent with March minutes. Recheck gasworks papers. Note initials in red ink, possibly later additions. The pages that followed were dense. Some bore tiny photocopies of municipal maps. Others featured notes in the margins. Compare with Ledger 12A. Missing, and same paper stock, but ink different. One was marked with an X in the corner and read simply, Daffodil Lane request denied by planning. But document says approved? Purbright read on. One phrase repeated, not recorded in the master register. At the bottom of the third page, in a different pen and more recently, was a curious line. If Mrs. Gilbard still has the 1950 annex log, she'll know why the file was pulled. That name again. Mrs. Gilbard, head of the Flaxborough Historical Society, custodian of more ceremonial rosettes and discontinued municipal newsletters than any living soul, had appeared on Purbright's radar more than once. Not for criminal activity, never that, but for her practiced vagueness when it came to requests for archived materials not properly vetted for heritage context. He slipped the notebook back into the bag, then tapped the intercom. Sergeant Love, ring ahead to the Historical Society, would you? See if Mrs. Gilbard is available this afternoon. A pause. Then, she's always available, sir. Except when she isn't. Quite. We'll take our chances. Before leaving, he stopped by the evidence locker and withdrew the envelope with the disputed letter. He compared the signature, J.G. Fromm, to that on a previous memo Sybil had copied into her notebook. Same slanted F, same low swoop on the G, but the older signature was shakier, the ink paler. Natural aging. The 1949 version was crisp and eager. He did not speak as they drove across town, but Love, attempting conversation, ventured, Gasworks land, sir? Bit of a dead end, isn't it? Nothing out there now but foxes and those new bus shelters. Purbright didn't correct him. The Flaxborough Historical Society was housed in the old vicarage, a building which had never truly accepted its secular conversion. It retained the quiet guilt of sermons once delivered and radiators that had never functioned. Mrs. Gilbard received them in the front room, surrounded by shelves labeled with string tags in italic handwriting. Follies and pump covers, 1911 to 1936. Mayorals. Unsorted. School board ephemera. I was wondering when you'd come, she said without welcome, though I imagined it might be about the theatre matter. I'm afraid today it's the gasworks, Purbright replied pleasantly. Mrs. Gilbard's face stiffened as though recalling a long-forgotten dental appointment. We're revisiting some discrepancies in the land use records, he continued. Specifically 1949. There appears to be a letter signed by Councillor Fromm authorizing the sale of certain parcels. Impossible. He died in 1947. Indeed. Mrs. Gilbard moved stiffly toward one of the lower cabinets and retrieved a black file. We have nothing formal after 1946. The war disrupted things, of course. Records went missing. Meetings weren't minuted properly. You understand. May I? He took the file. Inside were neatly typed summaries of land assignments, most initialed in the corner by someone using a green ink pen. One page had been removed. He could see the stub where the staple had torn. At the back, a folded memo caught his eye. He opened it. A note, handwritten in the same green ink, read, A just entry. Retain original in private archive. Purbright handed it back. And this private archive? Mrs. Gilbard's lips formed a smile without any warmth. Inspector, do you know how much material comes through here each year? Not everything is appropriate for public indexing. Who decides what's appropriate? I do. Naturally. He nodded. And would that include land deeds signed posthumously? She said nothing, but her knuckles whitened against the file's edge. On their way out, Purbright said nothing for a full block. Then, private archives, misleading approvals, vanished meeting minutes. What's the betting our ceremonial whistle wasn't the only thing tampered with this week? Love, who was still half puzzling over the sprinkles on the floor, looked up. Do you think someone's gone to the trouble of forging records just to cover up a land grab from half a century ago? Perhaps not half a century. Purbright said mildly, but it seems someone believes what happened back then still matters very much today. They reached the car just as the sun began its reluctant descent behind Flaxborough's chimney pots. The first drops of a spring drizzle began to fall. The drizzle had grown more insistent by the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love reached the unremarkable gate of 17 Daffodil Lane. The semi-detached house, crouched between two others of similar architectural remorse, bore all the traits of Flaxborough's post-war expansion: pebble-dashed frontage, dubious guttering, and a privet hedge with opinions of its own. Purbright lifted the latch and pushed through the creaking gate. "Keep an eye on the left garden bed, Love. That rose bush has ideas above its station." Love obligingly sidestepped and muttered something about local flora, becoming more aggressive in council-owned soil. They were here, ostensibly, to follow up on one of Sybil Tolomachez's more cryptic notebook entries, the reference to the 1950 land audit, in the curious case of Daffodil Lane. The house had been one of the few in the area whose planning paperwork had seemingly been amended in two distinct hands, one original, the other a later addition approving a boundary extension that no living resident recalled requesting. A woman answered the door after 2 knocks and the sound of something being hastily shut in a drawer. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with ironed hair, a floral apron, and the cautious manner of someone who didn't like surprises unless they came in envelopes marked premium bonds. "Yes?" she asked, not rudely, but with a suspicious curl at the edge of her mouth. "Mrs. Lister, we're here regarding some historical planning documents linked to your property," Purbright said, offering his warrant card in a mild, non-threatening way, like a man offering an elderly cat a sardine. She took a moment, then nodded. "You'd better come in. Mind the runner. It's loose on the 3rd tile." Inside, the sitting room smelled faintly of floor polish and stewed apples. A neatly crocheted antimacassar clung desperately to the arm of an armchair where a fluffy orange cat was clearly winning a long campaign to remove it. Mrs. Lister sat down carefully, smoothing her apron. "I've been expecting someone," she said, "ever since I saw the ambulance outside the council offices." "You were acquainted with Councillor Tolomache?" "We went to school together," she said, as if this were more incriminating than it sounded. "We weren't what you'd call friends. She liked order. I liked secrets." "Did she ever mention the gasworks land, or her research into old council records?" "She came by about a fortnight ago. Said she was looking into historical inconsistencies. Asked if I remembered anything odd when the extension was built." "And do you?" Mrs. Lister hesitated. "I remember my father saying we were lucky. Everyone else got 21 feet of back garden. We got 28. He called it a reward for quiet loyalty. Never explained it." "Quiet loyalty to whom?" "Not said. My father wasn't a talker." Purbright nodded. "May I ask what he did for a living?" "He was the assistant clerk to the planning office, handled document transfers, filing. You know, paperwork nobody noticed until it went missing. That would have given him access to the original ledgers." "I suppose." She stood suddenly and went to a cabinet, returning with an envelope thick with folded pages. "I was going to burn these," she said. "Then Sybil asked about that planning approval. Made me think." Purbright took the envelope and opened it on the coffee table. Inside were photocopies of meeting minutes, some stamped revised, others bearing annotations in familiar green ink. One caught his eye immediately, a line reading, "Adjustment approved under verbal instruction, JGF." "Initials again," said Love, peering over his shoulder. "Quite," murmured Purbright. "Same as the letter Sybil found, but no full signature this time." He turned to Mrs. Lister. "Did your father keep original records?" She shrugged. "He kept everything. Newspapers, wine corks, jokes clipped from Punch in 1948. There's a trunk in the loft full of things, he said, might one day be awkward. I always assumed it was tax records." "May we take a look?" It took them 30 minutes to extract the trunk, another 15 to dust it, and then nearly an hour of sifting through what Love described as the documentary equivalent of a hedgehog's nest before they found something useful. Folded deep inside a ledger dated 1950 was a carbon copy, faint, brittle, with a handwritten addendum in the margin. Original page removed by request, March 1951. Keep duplicate in private files. Do not index. The handwriting was different again. Angular, rushed, not the green ink, not Fraumer. "What do we make of this, sir?" Love asked, frowning. That someone wanted to bury certain land transactions but couldn't quite resist leaving a note about it. He glanced again at the note Sybil had written, not his handwriting, and nodded inwardly. There were, it seemed, at least 2 sets of hands involved in the fabrication, possibly 3, and perhaps one of them was still watching. As they left, Purbright paused on the step. Across the narrow lane, a man stood beside a van marked Hollamby Drainage, holding a clipboard and pretending to take notes on a drain cover that hadn't been lifted since rationing ended. Their eyes met briefly. The man gave a tight smile and climbed into his van. "Friend of yours?" Love asked. "Unlikely, unless I've suddenly become acquainted with civil engineers." They watched the van turn the corner. It didn't stop at any other house. Purbright made a quiet note of the number plate. "Back to the station?" "Not quite yet," Purbright said, still looking down the lane. "I think it's time we asked the planning office who had authority to change records in 1951. The Flaxborough Municipal Planning Office, tucked behind the library and known for housing more forms than ideas, had the air of a place determined to make time itself redundant. The walls were beige by tradition rather than paint, and the filing cabinets gave off a scent that suggested both dust and quiet defiance. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love were greeted at the glass-paneled reception window by Miss Latimer, woman with rimless glasses, and a speaking voice that hovered just above ambient air pressure. "We don't generally handle walk-ins," she said without blinking, as though the concept of an unannounced visit was more threatening than a bomb scare. "I'm sure you don't," Purbright replied gently. "We're interested in permissions granted in 1950 and 1951, specifically those concerning the gasworks border and Daffodil Lane." Miss Latimer frowned. "I'm afraid anything prior to 1955 is under off-site storage. We use a system now. You'll have to file a requisition. Processing takes 8 working days." 8 working days, Love repeated under his breath, as if translating a mythical length of time. Purbright remained calm. Would those files include original ledgers, or only summaries? "Summaries," Miss Latimer said proudly. "We digitized the index cards in 92. "And prior to that?" "Who maintained access?" "Before the Central Archive Initiative. That would have been under the chief clerk's discretion. We had Mr. Hemmings in the late 60s. Before him, a Mr. Hopley. But I think, yes, in 1951 it would have been Edgar Welkin." "Welkin?" Purbright asked, pausing. "That's a name I've not heard in some time." "He wasn't long in the position, 2 years at most, left suddenly. Some say for health reasons, though Mrs. Lorimer said it was a woman in Blyton." "Do we know where he is now?" Miss Latimer hesitated. "We do not. No forwarding address ever filed. He simply stopped turning up one week." "Did he leave any record behind? Personal files? Correspondence?" "Unlikely. He wasn't the filing type." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Was he the sort who might have signed off an adjustment without committee?" Miss Latimer gave a thin smile. "He once approved a cycle shelter on a bus route." "So yes. I wonder," Purbright mused aloud, "whether someone found that quality quite useful." They were shown into a back room where pre-archival materials were kept. Here the dust was less metaphorical and more deeply territorial. Love pulled a pair of gloves from his pocket. He'd learned this routine the hard way during an earlier inquiry involving pigeon permits. the box they wanted, labeled Town Council, Minutes 1950 to 1952, unofficial notes and marginals, sat on the bottom shelf. Purbright eased it out carefully, laying it flat. Inside, the contents were predictably chaotic. Pages clipped but unsorted, overlapping memos, pages duplicated by carbon, several handwritten meeting reflections, clearly composed by a secretary with a fondness for purple ink and personal editorializing. One such entry, dated March 1951, caught Purbright's eye. The handwriting was fluid, slightly careless, but distinct. Councillor Fraum's name invoked again our gasworks parcel adjustments. Clerk Welkin noted adjustments in motion per prior understanding. When questioned by Councillor Barker, Welkin stated, "Not all things require rebirth by committee. Minutes to be formalized next week." The note was unsigned. Welkin invoked a dead councillor's name, Love muttered. Or someone invoked it on his behalf. Either way, the decision bypassed scrutiny. They kept reading. Another folded page, this one crisper and more recent, had clearly been added later. In different handwriting again, more careful, smaller script, was the line, "Original amendment page removed, replaced by abstract." See Ledger 12A, missing. They sat in silence for a moment. "Ledger 12A again," Love said. "That's what Sybil mentioned. It seems to be the ghost every door swings open to reveal. Still missing? Likely. Or buried where only Mrs. Gilbard's mysterious private archive can sniff it out." It was then that Purbright's attention drifted to the edge of the box lid. Someone had scrawled a series of letters in faded pencil. "CHR, see also ART." "CHR?" Love asked. "Council Housing Records," Purbright offered. "And ART, Allocation Request Transfers." "Or," said Purbright, "Approved Record Transcripts." Love rubbed his chin. It's like they made their own language. "Obfuscation is a civic skill," Purbright murmured. "Some councils built reputations on it." They closed the box and thanked Miss Latimer, who made a note in her ledger. Whether to record their visit or ban future ones was unclear. Outside, the rain had picked up. It smudged the windscreen in blurring arcs as Love started the car. "Where to now, sir?" Purbright considered it. "We have forged documents, a missing ledger, a vanished clerk, and a councillor who collapsed shortly after rediscovering them all." He looked out the window, watching the gentle trickle of water slide down the glass like the years themselves. "I think we ought to speak to someone who understands how legacies like this are kept alive. Someone with a vested interest in memory." "Gilbard again?" Number 2 controlled. 2, well preserved. "No, I want to talk to someone who benefited." Love raised an eyebrow. "Who do you have in mind?" Purbright allowed a rare, wintry smile. "Councillor Biddle. He's always been generous with his recollections, especially when he thinks they make him sound important." Councillor Biddle's front garden bore the same characteristics as the man himself. Overgrown with self-importance, perfumed with something vaguely cloying, and not entirely clear on where the edges were meant to be. Petunias jostled with ornamental cabbages. A garden gnome wielding a golf club stood proudly beside a cracked bird bath, and a large plastic owl surveyed the scene from atop a lopsided trellis. When Purbright and Love approached the door, it opened before they could knock. "I saw you coming from the upstairs window," Biddle announced. "Always glad to assist our fine constabulary in their noble efforts. Do come in. I've just brewed a fresh pot. Assam." The living room was a museum of commemorative plates and ambitious upholstery. A mahogany cabinet housed a small collection of model trains, each labeled with its route, date of service, and, most tellingly, the civic ceremony at which Biddle had apparently unveiled it. Purbright declined the tea with a polite murmur. Love accepted and regretted it after the first sip. "Councillor," Purbright began, settling onto a chair that resisted with a squeak, "we're revisiting some matters related to council land usage around 1950 and 1951, particularly the parcels surrounding the old gasworks." Biddle leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Ah, yes, that old chestnut. Caused a fuss even then. Allegations of nepotism, hasty approvals, that sort of thing. All very overblown, of course. Administrative efficiency was a different beast in those days." "You were quite junior at the time?" "Merely an alternate delegate on the Committee for Amenities and Litter Abatement," Biddle said with a hint of pride. "But one kept one's ears open. There was chatter." "Chatter from whom?" Biddle looked theatrically upward, as if fishing names from a celestial Rolodex. "Fraumer, of course, though he was on his way out by the time the gasworks matter arose. Edgar Welkin had the clerk's pen. Rum fellow, bit of a loner, preferred off-the-record chats in stairwells, wore gloves in July." "And did Welkin ever discuss those land approvals with you directly?" "Not directly, but I recall a meeting. March 1951? Yes, must have been. There was a heated exchange. Councillor Barker, an absolute terrier of a man, asked why certain parcels had appeared in the ledger without committee scrutiny." "What was Welkin's response?" "Said something about pre-authorization, historical precedent." He waved a letter. "Claimed Fraum had left a list of intentions before his passing." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Was this letter ever seen by others?" "Only fleetingly. I remember someone saying the ink looked fresh for a letter supposedly written in 1947. And the stationery, well, not wartime issue, shall we say. Quite plush. Do you recall if that document was entered into the official minutes?" Biddle hesitated. "I believe it was referenced, but not appended. Things were more fluid then. Our clerk at the time typed summaries, not verbatim transcripts." Purbright leaned forward slightly. "Did anyone challenge the authenticity of the letter?" "Oh, yes. Councillor Gilbard did, actually. Bertram, not his wife. Said Fraumer hadn't dictated anything of the sort in his final months. Insisted Fraumer was suffering from aphasia and couldn't write coherently by the end." Love shifted in his seat. "So Gilbard effectively said the document was forged?" "Not in those words, no," Biddle said, waving a dismissive hand. "He said it was over-generously attributed, which in council speak is rather like being called a damned liar at a christening." Purbright allowed himself a breath of amusement. "And what became of the disagreement?" "Buried," Biddle said simply. "Welkin promised to produce a second copy, but then vanished the following month. Took his leave citing exhaustion and disappeared. Some say it was a nervous breakdown. Others, well, there were whispers." "What sort of whispers?" "That he'd been pressured, that someone leaned on him to push those approvals through." "By whom?" "That was never clear, though there were those on the housing board who benefited handsomely from the expanded perimeters. A few relatives got plots at surprisingly generous rates." Purbright stood. "Did Sybil Tolomache ever ask you about any of this?" Biddle blinked. "She did, actually. Last autumn. Said she'd been cross-checking land transfers and found anomalies. Asked if I remembered who controlled the annex ledgers back then." "And you told her?" "I told her they weren't public, and that if she was digging, she'd want to speak to Mrs. Gilbard." Purbright paused. "You sent her to Mrs. Gilbard? Well, who else would have the old files? Bertram died years ago, but his widow inherited a great many papers from his time on council. Did Sybil mention whether she found what she was looking for?" Biddle's fingers drummed nervously on the tea tray. "She said she'd uncovered something unsettling. Mentioned the word erasure. Thought a name had been deliberately removed from a key document." "Did she say which name?" "She didn't," Biddle said. "But she looked frightened, which wasn't like her. Sybil was a woman of formidable resolve." Purbright thanked him, exchanged the usual courteous nods, and stepped back into the chill air with Love at his side. "Well?" Love asked once they'd cleared the hedge. "She was getting close," Purbright said softly, "and someone knew it." As they walked back toward the car, a small detail tugged at Purbright's memory. The phrase Biddle had used, over-generously attributed, a polite way of saying the dead man never wrote it. Inspector Purbright's boots made a low, patient rhythm as he crossed the stone flags of Flaxborough Library's local history annex. There was a peculiar scent to the place: vanilla paper, paraffin floor polish, and the faint tang of recently opened envelopes. Along the walls, notices for genealogy clubs and a town charters lecture looked down with faded optimism. He was here not for books, but to re-examine what Councillor Tollemache had most recently tried to access. Her name was neatly signed in the visitor ledger 3 days before her collapse. Entry time, 2:46 p.m., exit time unrecorded. "Looking for the Tollemache file, Inspector?" asked Mr. Quayle, the librarian, sliding into view with a cardigan that seemed to be losing a quiet fight with gravity. "If it's still here," Purbright said. "She signed in, but nothing shows that she checked out any reference material." "Because she didn't," Quayle replied. "She asked for something we didn't hold. Council Ledger 12A. Said it was once logged in the back stacks, pre-microfiche era. I told her that set had been partially deaccessioned in '96. Weed out order from the Historical Society." "Mrs. Gilbard's domain." "Precisely, though she wouldn't like you calling it that." Quayle's eyes twitched toward a framed photo of Mrs. Gilbard presenting a stuffed hedgehog to the Lord Mayor. "She prefers to call herself Custodian Emerita." "And yet," Purbright said, "Sybil seemed to think the file might still exist. She asked to check the back copy log. I let her into the reference alcove, unsupervised, I'm afraid, but she left abruptly, didn't even say goodbye, just muttered something about redacting names." "Redacting? That's the word she used." Purbright thanked him and requested to see the copy log. Quayle led him to a metal cabinet whose keys hung on his belt via a length of twine. Inside, the logs were ordered by ledger number. He retrieved the one labeled 12A, Access Chronology. Several names were listed: council researchers, university historians, one local journalist, but the most recent entry, dated nearly 2 decades prior, had been made in unusual circumstances. It read, "Accessed for internal audit. Order from Town Hall. Clerk initials GB. Love, standing behind Purbright, tilted his head. "Not a name I recognize." "Could be Gilbard," Purbright said softly. "Bertram, perhaps. The husband could also be a cover name." "Indeed, but it tells us someone wanted the ledger seen and then disappeared." They left the library and crossed the square toward the town hall, where the new incident had unfolded: the smashed ceremonial display case. The scene had been cleared, but its echoes lingered. Council notices still bore bits of glass in their pinholes, and someone had left a note taped to the wall. "Who profits from silence?" "I didn't write that," Love said quickly, though no one had asked. Purbright stepped inside. The vestibule still bore faint marks on the floor, fine shards caught in grout lines, and the radiator that had once concealed the ceremonial trowel now gurgled with meek heat. The receptionist, Miss Ainsley, offered them a quick glance before returning to her crossword. "Miss Ainsley," Purbright said gently, "has anyone reported seeing who entered the vestibule just before the display case was broken?" She didn't look up. "Half the council, and at least 3 members of the Rotary Ladies' Knitting Circle. We had open committee attendance that afternoon. Every 3rd Thursday, there were biscuits." "Were any names logged?" "I asked them to sign the foyer sheet. Whether they did is a separate matter." Purbright retrieved the clipboard and examined it. The handwriting ranged from assertive loops to faint scrawls. He paused at one entry that stood out for its neatness. "W. Dallimer." "Isn't he the solicitor?" Love asked. Retired now, Purbright said. Used to handle council property transfers in the 70s. And before that, he was junior clerk under Welkin. They were through the door before Love could say anything further. Dallimore lived on the north side of town in a modest brick home that had once belonged to his mother and still bore the same curtains she'd hung in 1962. He answered the door in slippers and a cardigan buttoned one short. "Inspector, I was wondering when this would reach me," he said with no pretense of surprise. "You were at the town hall when the display was broken." "I was. And I saw the cabinet fall, nothing more, but I suspected someone wanted it to." Purbright waited. "I used to file property transfers, you see," Dallimore continued, ushering them inside. "I never signed any I hadn't read. But Welkin, he was under pressure. From the Housing Board, the old planning committee. Names that rarely made the minutes. And Councillor Fromm's signature?" Dallimore led them into a study that smelled of dry tobacco and disuse. He opened a drawer and handed Purbright a sheet of paper. It was a practice page, columns of slanted G's and looping F's. "Someone was teaching themselves to forge his hand," Dallimore said. "This was found after Welkin vanished, hidden behind a file cabinet. I kept it. Why? Because I believed someone might come asking. Eventually. I wasn't brave then." Purbright turned the paper over. On the back was a faint notation. "Practice. Must shorten tail on F." "And Sybil?" he asked. "Did she come to you?" "She asked if I'd ever seen Ledger 12A. I told her I thought it had been absorbed into Mrs. Gilbard's private archive. She left in a hurry." Purbright folded the page. "You understand, of course, that withholding this was—" "I do. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Inspector. Only relevance." As they stepped back outside, the wind had picked up, shaking the cherry tree over Dallimore's drive. Pink blossoms scattered like confetti over the gravel. "She was close, wasn't she?" Love asked quietly. "Close enough that someone made her stop." By the time Purbright and Love returned to the station, the afternoon had settled into a steely stillness. Rain no longer fell, but the clouds remained, stubborn and low, clinging to the rooftops like gossip unwilling to let go. The desk sergeant handed Purbright a slim envelope with no return address. Inside was a single line, typewritten in uneven spacing. "Stop digging. You'll find what you deserve beneath the stage." Love blinked at it. "Theatre reference? Likely, unless they mean literal soil." It was a strange turn of phrase, too odd to be random. Purbright walked to the window and gazed out over the grey town. The Flaxborough Civic Theatre had recently doubled as a meeting hall while the main council chamber underwent refurbishment. A temporary stage had been erected for speeches and plaques. Beneath it, a shallow crawl space used for cables, props, and, increasingly, for things best left unmentioned. Sybil Tollemache had, notably, spoken there just 2 weeks prior, about public transparency and civic records. 10 minutes later, Purbright and Love were standing in the theatre's dim lobby, watched by a distracted janitor and a dusty statue of the patron saint of amateur dramatics. The crawl space under the dais was accessible through a narrow trap-door cleverly disguised beneath a rolling crate of coat racks. "It's always the coat racks," muttered Love, shifting the crate aside. Purbright knelt and opened the hatch. The air that rose was musty, tinged with old polish and something drier, perhaps paper left too long in hiding. He clicked on his torch and ducked below. The space was tight. Dust clung to his sleeves as he moved forward, beam of light slicing through cobwebs and half-forgotten detritus. There were props from pantomimes past, a rusted milk churn, several headless cardboard figures of councillors from a long-defunct mock parliament night, and, wedged deep between a wooden support and the brick foundation, a grey cardboard folder wrapped in string. He tugged it free with a soft grunt and emerged, coughing slightly, brushing plaster flecks from his coat. Love took it from him. No markings. Unwrap it. Inside were 7 sheets of old council stationery, crisp despite their hiding place. Each bore a typed paragraph, formal, procedural, and disarmingly dull. But Purbright's eye moved quickly to the footers, where the signatures had been neatly added in dark ink. 6 were familiar. The 7th, page 4, was unsigned. But in the bottom right corner, just above the filing code, were the faint traces of erased pencil marks. Under certain light, the impression was still there, a name. "Fraum," said Love quietly. "Only this time, erased." Purbright nodded. They forged it once. Then someone tried to undo it. Each sheet outlined minor adjustments to land parcels across the northwest quadrant of the town. Small boundary nudges, recategorization of common land, reallocation of inspection responsibility. Harmless on paper, but when mapped onto current deeds, they traced a careful pattern, a kind of municipal laundering of oversight. Someone had constructed a legal fiction, brick by brick, ink by ink. And yet it was the unsigned page, both present and absent, that made the strongest case. Hamisit vani megforditva, letezes eleg bisonitek. Back at the station, Purbright laid the sheets on the table, comparing them against Sybil's notebook. Her handwriting danced between ink types and emotions. Frustration, then triumph, then something darker. "Her final entry," he said, "references a missing index card, file a 12B. She believed it had been clipped out deliberately. It matched this 4th page's contents exactly." Love frowned. So it was clipped, forged, signed, erased, and buried. With the entire council none the wiser. Or rather, Purbright corrected, with most of them uninterested in knowing. He turned to the envelope with the typewritten threat again. It came from someone who knew what she'd found, who perhaps had reason to panic now that we're nearing it too. He folded the note and set it beside the erased signature. Sybil saw something that confirmed it, a detail she couldn't unsee. And then, not a week later, she collapses in public. Love shifted uneasily. Could have been coincidence. Shock, health, perhaps. But why pin a note to her coat? The question lingered. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Miss Teatime from the council office, holding a slim plastic wallet. "This was in the pigeonhole, addressed to Mrs. Tolmachi," she said, "marked confidential. I opened it because, well, she won't be needing it now, will she?" Purbright accepted it with a nod and opened the packet. Inside, a photocopy of a document with marginalia in red pen. It was a property transfer, dated 1950. The buyer, a shell corporation, long since dissolved. The seller, Flaxborough Civic Estates Committee, initialed in the corner, E.W., and then, in the margin, added in Sybil's unmistakable hand, was a single word circled 3 times. "Biddle?" For all his bluster and buttered vowels, Councillor Biddle had always maintained a deep affection for the Flaxborough Spring Flower Show. Not for the blossoms themselves, though he could distinguish a begonia from a dahlia with theatrical certainty, but because it was the one public event where he could stand before a table of reluctant blooms, clasp his hands behind his back, and pronounce judgment with the same solemnity as if he were reviewing a tax proposal, which made his sudden absence that Saturday morning all the more curious. "Not like him to miss his moment," muttered Miss Teatime to Purbright, who had arrived uninvited but not unwelcomed. "Especially when he's got a sash to wear and a ribbon to cut." "Did he confirm attendance?" Purbright asked mildly, watching a petulant wind flatten a display of junior category tulips. "Confirmed it 3 times. Even rang last night to request a separate microphone." Perhaps something's come up. But his tone, as ever, suggested otherwise. He turned slowly, eyes roaming the crowd. Local dignitaries, stall-holders, and elderly entrants guarding their gladioli as if they were Fabergé eggs. The mayor was in attendance, perspiring quietly beneath a canvas, awning and nibbling at a commemorative biscuit. No Biddle. "Shall I ring his house?" asked Love, who had just returned from interrogating the sponge cake tent. Purbright shook his head. "We'll call in shortly. If he's absent, he's not absent for lack of interest." They walked together through the rows of displays. Flowers, preserves, a curious assortment of vegetable animals, while Purbright considered the circled name in Sybil's last notes. "Why him?" Love asked quietly, aware that eavesdropping in Flaxborough required no more than a raised eyebrow. She believed he had a personal link to one of the altered transfers, Purbright replied. A signature, perhaps, buried or copied from a junior ledger, but if she circled his name, she knew something stronger, something more immediate. They turned past a stall advertising organic marrows and moved toward the council display tent, where a freshly printed program had been abandoned, flapping in the breeze. Purbright picked it up and scanned the list. "Here," he said, pointing. "Judge for Division B, Councillor Walter Biddle." "And he's not here," Love repeated. "No." Nor was his name crossed out. By 11:30, the organizers were growing tetchy. A young man from the printing office had been dragooned into announcing results over a distorted tannoy, mispronouncing half the flower names and awarding a highly commended to a dahlia that had collapsed under its own sense of futility. It was nearly noon when Purbright and Love arrived at Biddle's home. The garden looked the same as it had earlier that week, over-manicured in places, untamed in others, but now the blinds were drawn, and a folded newspaper sat on the mat, undisturbed. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Love peered through the letterbox. No sound. No light. Purbright stepped back and scanned the perimeter. "Let's try the back." The side gate was latched, but not locked. They entered the garden, passing a curious arrangement of garden gnomes that appeared to be in the middle of a civic committee. The back door was ajar. Purbright paused, then gently pushed it open. The kitchen was cold. Tea bags sat in a chipped cup beside a kettle that hadn't boiled. There was toast in the grill, slightly charred, suggesting a start interrupted. "Mr. Biddle?" Love called. No answer. They moved through the bungalow, noting the details: a half-buttoned shirt draped over a chair, a folder of council papers spread across a table, and on the floor near the bureau, a single shoe. Tan leather, worn at the heel. Then, from the end of the hallway, the unmistakable sound of running water. They found him in the bathroom. Biddle was seated on the edge of the tub, fully clothed, water pouring steadily into the basin from the tap. His eyes were glassy, fixed on the mirror opposite. In one hand, he held a damp photograph. In the other, an envelope with its seal broken. "Mr. Biddle?" Purbright said, not unkindly. No response. Only a blink, slow and uncertain. Love stepped forward and gently took the envelope from his hand. Inside was a copy of the same document Sybil had marked, a property transfer with initials altered, the margin smudged where something had been scrubbed. "He's been sent a warning," Love murmured. Purbright crouched beside Biddle. "Walter," he said, voice low, "you need to tell us what you knew." Biddle swallowed. His voice, when it came, was a whisper. "They said it was a favor, a harmless name, just initials on a page. I never thought it would—" He broke off. "Who asked for the favor?" Purbright asked softly. "I don't know. It came from Welkin. Said it would help someone tidy things. I was a junior then, proud just to be asked. I signed what? The back of a minute sheet, authorizing retroactive edits. Said Fraum had forgotten to initial some parcels." "And you never questioned it?" "I was 25. They gave me a free luncheon and told me I was loyal." He blinked again. The water continued to run. "Sybil came to me," he added. "Said she found the paper. Asked if I'd ever heard of something called Annex Map D." "Did you?" I had, but it was marked "Do Not Circulate," stored with Gilbard's personal records. Did you tell her that? I did, and now she's in hospital. You think that was your fault? I think I told her where to dig. Purbright stood. Turn off the tap, love. As the water ceased, the bathroom filled with silence. We need to find that map, Purbright said quietly, before someone else decides the truth's too old to matter. Mrs. Gilbard opened her door with a look of composed expectation, as if she had been waiting not for them in particular, but for the moment to arrive. She wore the same neat scarf, pinned at the collar with the municipal emblem of Flaxborough in cloisonné enamel. An item long out of circulation and, some said, awarded only to those who had defended the borough's interests with exceptional discretion. Inspector Purbright, she said coolly, nodding at Sergeant Love, and his ever-faithful adjutant. Purbright gave a slight smile. We'd like to speak with you again, Mrs. Gilbard, about materials pertaining to the 1950 planning amendments. Specifically, a certain item once labeled Annex Map D. Her eyes narrowed, the polite shutters closing just a fraction more. There is no such item catalogued, she replied. That's rather the point. Love, uncharacteristically forward, added, We've just come from Councillor Biddle's residence. He's not in the mood to keep secrets. Mrs. Gilbard gave a crisp laugh, one that did not reach her eyes. I dare say Walter Biddle has never been in the mood for much, unless it came with sandwiches and a velvet ribbon. Purbright waited. I'm afraid I can't help you, she said at last, moving to close the door. I'm afraid we may need to make this a formal inquiry, Purbright said gently. A sealed document was recently recovered from beneath the stage at the Civic Theatre. It matches the margin notes in Councillor Tollemache's personal files. Files which reference an unlisted annex map, known to have passed through your late husband's hands. A flicker, barely a twitch, crossed her brow. My husband, she said, voice low, was a man of integrity. I'm not disputing that, but it seems others took liberties under his nose. Or perhaps in his name. Still she hesitated, fingers tightening on the edge of the doorframe. Finally, she stepped back. If we're to discuss this, she said, it will not be in the hall. They followed her through the narrow corridors of the Historical Society, past displays of civic buttons and wartime ration notices, to a rear room lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets of uncertain vintage. Mrs. Gilbard produced a brass key from the inner pocket of her cardigan. This cabinet, she said, has not been opened in 18 years, not since the old clerk's office was dismantled. She unlocked it with ceremony and drew out a flat drawer labeled simply Map Supplements, Restricted. From within, she retrieved a grey folio case bound in ribbon. It bore no markings apart from an old pencil scrawl in the corner, D. She untied it and laid it on the long table. Inside was a single sheet, a composite overlay map showing Flaxborough's northwest sector. The gasworks, the council estate, and a surrounding margin labelled Parcel Adjustments, 1950, unratified. Across it, faint red lines had been drawn by hand, indicating the original boundaries. Beneath, in a less confident hand, blue lines suggested newer, expanded plots. Purbright pointed to a margin notation. E.W. Edgar Welkin, she said quietly. The clerk. He submitted this as a reference draft, but my husband reviewed it, found no supporting minutes, and ordered it withheld. Yet it was not destroyed. My husband believed in preserving the lie, so that one day it might be proven as such. Purbright studied the lines again. It appears 3 parcels were expanded illegally. Yes. And do you recognize these owners? He asked, indicating the adjacent name tags. She did not reply. He traced one line with his finger, then another. All 3 were later sold to shell companies, each dissolved within 5 years. And the land reacquired by councillors through private holdings. Mrs. Gilbard finished softly. Purbright glanced at her. You knew. I suspected, but Bertram made me swear never to interfere. Said it was safer to let the guilty bury themselves. And now, someone tried to bury Sybil Tollemache. There was a pause, a heavy one. Purbright folded the map and slid it into an evidence folder. We'll need a formal statement from you, of course. Mrs. Gilbard nodded. I thought this day might come. Back at the station, Purbright laid the recovered documents across the desk. Sybil's notebook, the erased signature page, the map, and the copies from Dalamer and Biddle. 3 councillors benefited, he said, almost to himself. 2 of them now deceased. The 3rd. Love looked up from the file he'd been examining. Harold Nennings. Purbright nodded. Nennings had served on the Housing Board in 1950. He later chaired the Audit Committee and retired with a quietly amassed property portfolio, mostly unexamined until now. Still in town? Love asked. Living in the Care Flats on Church Hill, visits the cafe across from the bookshop every Thursday. Still insists on being called Chairman Emeritus. Purbright stood and took his coat. I think it's time we ask him whether he remembers anything about a certain clerk, a certain map, and a very quiet expansion. Love followed, already pulling on his gloves. You think he'll admit it? No, Purbright said, but he might correct us just enough to confirm it. Harold Nennings occupied the same corner table at Marjorie's cafe every Thursday, just after 11. He always ordered a pot of weak tea and a slice of Battenberg cake, and always pretended not to remember the name of the waitress. Today, he was already halfway through the sponge when Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love stepped inside. The cafe smelled of old biscuits and linoleum warmed by sun that never quite broke through. Its lace-curtained windows dulled the view outside, which suited Nennings, who had spent most of his career obscuring what others might have seen too clearly. I'm not under arrest, am I? He asked, without looking up, as Purbright pulled out the opposite chair. That rather depends, said Purbright, folding his coat neatly. We're revisiting an old matter. The land around the gasworks. Airte tol airte Imber the Nennings exhaled through his nose, then delicately dabbed the corner of his mouth with a monogrammed handkerchief. You'll have to be more precise, Inspector. I've approved a great many things over the years. So we've seen, said Purbright, producing a folder and laying the annex map gently between them. Nennings regarded it, but his expression didn't shift. I don't believe I've seen that before. Purbright removed the page with the erased signature and placed it on top. Perhaps you recall this version, the one that was quietly excised. Still nothing. The man had the restraint of someone who had watched his colleagues be caught out over decades and learned from each. You had knowledge of these boundary changes, Purbright continued calmly. Your initials don't appear, but the shell companies that purchased the parcels were eventually folded into your family trust. That's a matter of public record. Now. Nennings looked up, finally. Public records are like onions. They have layers, and they make people cry when handled improperly. Indeed. But when someone tries to rewrite the onion, as it were, and then remove the layers altogether, it becomes a different vegetable entirely. Nennings smirked at that. Purbright pressed on. Sybil Tollemache found the original boundary overlays. She realized someone had altered parcel dimensions, that someone had authorized the backdating of a letter from a councillor already deceased. I was told, Nennings said quietly, that it was Fraumer's intention, that Welkin had been given verbal instructions. The planning committee said there was no need to reopen the debate. Did you ever see those verbal instructions? Of course not, but I trusted the chain. And the signature? Nennings blinked slowly. I was a junior auditor, he said. I approved files if the signatures were in order. And they always were. That's one way to look at it, Purbright replied. Another way is that you knew, perhaps not at first, but later, after the deaths, the dissolutions, after the profits started appearing under your name. Nennings tapped his teacup. That's a rather dramatic construction. More dramatic than a forged council signature, more dramatic than parceling public land into private holdings under the guise of missing paperwork. More dramatic than sending veiled threats to a woman who'd uncovered the deception. I never threatened Sybil. But someone did. And someone also tried to intimidate us with that note about finding what we deserve beneath the stage. You remember the Civic Theatre? Nennings remained still. Your initials don't appear, Purbright continued, his voice steady. But everyone we've spoken to points to your influence. Quiet, indirect, but effective. Biddle gave permission for edits. Welkin carried them out. Fraumer's name was misused. You were in the background, but you always benefited. Nennings sat back. Is this a confession you're after? No, Purbright said, rising. It's a conclusion, one that may never see court, but which Flaxborough will understand all the same. He left the folder closed on the table. Outside, the clouds had lifted slightly. The drizzle had stopped. Love stood beside the car, watching a pensioner feed sparrows with crumbs from a paper bag. You think that's all we'll get? He asked as Purbright approached. I think it's all we need. They returned to the station, where a small group had gathered. Mrs. Gilbard, Miss Teatime, Dallimer, and Biddle, now cleaned up and clutching a mug of weak tea. Each had come, voluntarily, to provide statements. Each had brought something, memories, records, names. The chain, once scattered, had begun to link itself. By late afternoon, the report was typed, filed, and signed. No arrests were made. No front-page scandal followed. But the files were no longer missing. The ledger would be restored. The parcels would be re-examined. The truth, quiet, careful, methodical, was once again available to those who sought it. And in the municipal display cabinet, the ceremonial trowel was returned, polished to a faint gleam, with a new placard beneath it, commemorating dignity and oversight, Flaxborough Borough Council. Purbright watched its installation without ceremony, hands clasped behind his back. Love joined him. You think they'll let it lie? They usually do, Purbright said. But it's important someone remembers. And what about Sybil? She'll recover, and she'll be listened to now. A beat passed. She'd have made a fine inspector, Love said. Purbright smiled faintly. She already was.